All right, I think we've given everyone a few minutes to get connected here. You'll notice that as you were connecting, we were getting connected and set to. We are recording this session so it can be posted online later, and we are streaming to the department's YouTube channel at the moment as well. So welcome everyone as we get folks connected here. Again, welcome to Forestry's information session on portions of Senate Bill 762, the 2021 legislative session's omnibus wildfire bill. Senate Bill 762 brings new programs and responsibilities to the Department of Forestry and to several state agencies and quite a variety to forestry. Tonight, we'll be primarily focusing on sections 18 to 20 and section 24 that establishes 2 new grant programs to restore resiliency in Oregon's public and private forests. I'm Derek Gasparini, I'm Public Affairs Officer with the department. I'll facilitate tonight's presentation and discussion. We'll do some introductions, including our presenters and members of the work group convened to help ODF determine the grant criteria for Senate Bill 762, Section 18 grant program, now called the Forest Restoration and Resiliency Investment Program. We'll then give an overview of what ODF hopes to accomplish with tonight's information session, explain the public comment period and process, have presentations on each of the 2 grant programs, and have a questions and answer session after each of the presentations. Before we get started with introductions, I'll ask that you use the chat feature to log your questions. Add your questions at any time, and we'll cover them in the next available Q&A session. So when we open a question and answer session, we'll catch up on all of the questions already in the chat, and we'll ask then if anyone also wants to raise their hand just to voice their question. That is fine, but we'll field questions during those times. But please, as you think of them, put them in the chat and we'll make sure and get to you. I also just want to throw out there that you may have visited the ODF website to get information on this session. And if you did, perhaps you saw our new subscription service to receive information about ODF and its programs. When you visit oregon.gov/ODF, you'll see a banner asking if you want to sign up to receive information. It's a subscription service. If you choose to subscribe, you'll then get a list of topics that you can choose from, and there is a specific topic for 762. And if you subscribe, you'll receive messages about new developments and project status pretty regularly. If you visit the website and decline on that banner, you won't get that banner again, but you can always sign up for that subscription. There's multiple links on Forestry's site to sign up later for subscriptions if you like. We hope you benefit from tonight's information session, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts and comments throughout this process and through the process of establishing the grant programs. So I think we have everything, everyone connected and ready here. We've got a fantastic audience. We've got 80 so far, which is a great turnout, more than we were initially expecting. So we hope that you benefit from this, and we'll look forward to addressing as many and all of your questions as we can. So we'll do a few introductions of ODF staff and work group members. So we'll start with Ryan Gordon.
Good evening. Thanks for joining. My name is Ryan Gordon. I'm the Interim Partnership and Planning Program Director.
Thank you, Ryan. Jeff Burns.
Good evening. My name is Jeff Burns. I'm with the Partnership and Planning Program and really specifically putting my energy behind 762 grant programs right now. Nice to see everyone tonight.
Thank you, Jeff. And Alex Rumlow.
Good evening, folks. Alex Romwell. I'm acting as the Small Forest Land Grant Program Lead in the Partnership and Planning Program.
Thanks, Alex. Megan Inley.
Good evening, all. Megan Inley. I am the admin support for the Partnership and Planning Program within the Oregon Department of Forestry.
Thank you, Megan. So now with such a large group of participants, some of the work group members are getting lost in the participants list here. So I'd ask for you to raise your hand and I'd be happy to call on you to introduce yourselves to the group. I know I saw EJ and Dana and a couple others there. So if you want to raise your hands, I'm happy to call on you. EJ Davis.
Good evening, everyone. I'm EJ Davis. I'm the Interim Director of Oregon State University's Extension Fire Program and a member of the work group.
Thank you, EJ. Chandra?
Hello, my name is Chandra Legui, and I work for Oregon Wild out of our Eugene office.
Thank you. Dana?
Hi, good evening, everybody. I'm Dana Skelly. I work for the Forest Service. I manage the hazardous fuels program for the Pacific Northwest. Thanks so much for joining us today. And thanks for having us here, Derek.
No, thank you, Dana. Dallas?
Hi, I'm Dallas Halder-Fries. I'm the Baker County Sage-Grouse Local Implementation Team Coordinator. So I'm representing more rangeland specific programs on the work group.
Thank you. And Pete?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Pete Caligieri. I am the Forest Strategy Director for the Nature Conservancy here in Oregon. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Pete. Anyone else from the work group present that I may miss or haven't raised their hand yet? All right. Thank you so much. Now we'll jump into the agenda with an overview and a purpose statement from Ryan Gordon.
Great, thank you. And thanks again, everybody, for making time to join us tonight. I especially want to thank the members of the work group, not only for their participation tonight, but for their engagement in this process in its entirety. That's taken a lot of their time, and we really appreciate their input and investment. Derek already gave kind of a quick overview of the night. We've gone through the introductions. I'm going to continue on here with a few more opening comments about the department and SB 762 and talk about the process moving forward. And then we'll get into two small presentations, one about the Small Forest Land Grant Program, and then the next about the Forest Restoration and Resiliency Investment Program. And then we'll have an opportunity for some Q&A and dialogue with all of you. And have a few other closing comments. Again, as Derek mentioned, we'll try to drive your questions through the chat. So as they come to mind, please drop them in there so that we don't lose track of them. So if we flip to the next slide, I always like to start with just a quick overview of the Oregon Department of Forestry. I think many folks joining us here probably know a fair amount about our business. But sometimes it's helpful to have that context. So we're organized into 4 primary programs, which are highlighted on the slide here. Our protection program is focused on mitigation and coordinated protection of about 16 million acres of predominantly private forest lands in Oregon. But we also do protect some public lands, especially BLM lands west of the Cascades. Our state forest program manages about 700,000 acres of Board of Forestry lands for economic, environmental, and social values. Our private forest program focuses on implementation of the Oregon Forest Practices Act. It also houses our forest health and monitoring programs, our urban and community forestry program, and our landowner assistance programs. And then finally, the partnership and planning program, which is represented well here tonight on this webinar, focuses on partnerships, grants, and agreements with external partners, and also houses our federal forest restoration program, which provides support for the federal forest collaboratives and engages with our federal partners via the Good Neighbor Authority to help advance restoration on federal lands. We can go ahead and move to the next slide. So we're here this evening specifically to discuss Senate Bill 762, which is the wildfire omnibus bill that was passed during the 2021 legislative session. That bill invests about $220 million statewide to help Oregon modernize and improve wildfire preparedness. And those investments are in 3 primary areas: helping to create fire adapted communities, developing safe and effective response, and helping to increase the resilience of Oregon's landscapes. And our conversation tonight is really focused on that 3rd bullet point, increasing landscape resiliency across the state. SB 762 included a lot of legislative direction for ODF and made some pretty substantial investments in the department. But tonight we're just going to focus on sections 18 through 20 and section 24 for our conversation. And we'll get into more detail on each of these, but just by way of an overview, sections 18 through 20 focus on the development of a forest restoration and resiliency investment program. And that specifically is a $20 million investment for landscape scale projects that are designed to help reduce wildfire risk and increase landscape resiliency statewide. Included in sections 18 through 20 as well is the development of a 20-year strategic plan. And we'll touch on that just briefly this evening towards the end of the presentation. Section 24 creates a small forest land grant program and makes an investment of $5 million to help support small landowner wildfire risk reduction activities. And again, we'll dive in deeper there. Before I hand it back to Derek, just wanted to talk a little bit also about public engagement with these processes and the development of these programs specifically. So Derek already outlined some of the options that are available through our external website, and we've been working really hard to build a good presence for SB 762 implementation on our external website, and I really encourage you to visit and dig in there and sign up for the Gov Delivery functionality that's just been added to receive timely updates. As we've alluded to here tonight, we've developed a work group that is specifically focused on sections 18 through 20, the development of that large landscape scale investment program. And that's where we're really, looking to spend a fair amount of our time this evening. And that work group is helping us to design and create some sideboards for that program that Jeff is going to talk more about later on. We're also working with our Committee for Family Forest Lands on the development and implementation of that smaller forest land grant program as well. And the same deal there. The folks that are represented on CFF are helping us to kind of create those sideboards for that program. And Alex is going to talk a little bit more about that as well. So this evening, what we're looking for, in addition to providing some information to all of you about where we're at on the development of these two grant programs, we're interested in your questions and we're interested in your feedback. So this evening, we really want to kind of stick with that Q&A format. But if there are some lingering issues or there's other input, more detailed input that you would like to provide to this process, that you would like either the work group or the Committee for Family Forest Lands to review, I would encourage you to visit the website and submit those written comments to us. We'll take everything that we receive by 5 p.m. on November 1st and summarize it and provide it to those two groups for consideration as they continue to work through the build out of these two programs and provide their final recommendations to us for implementation. So I think with that is a little bit of context and some idea of the road ahead. I am going to go ahead and turn it back over to Derek and we'll jump into the rest of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan, for that overview of the bill and the department. As Ryan was describing that, I did put a link in the chat to the Senate Bill 762 information page on Forestry's website. You can click that link directly from the chat and it'll take you to the Senate Bill 762 landing page. There is the subscription link to sign up for the Gov Delivery subscription service that I mentioned earlier. There are also links to both the Forest Restoration and Resiliency Investment Program and the Small Forest Land Grant Program. On each of those two program pages, is the email address to send public comment on either of the two programs. So hopefully you'll be able to find those to be able to submit any sort of comment or input that you'd like to provide on the programs here. So with that, and I do see that there's questions already in the chat. We will get to those at the Q&A session, but please keep adding them, and we will run through that list when we get to the appropriate time. So next, I will tee up Alex Romlo to talk about the Small Forest Land Grant Program.
Hey, well, again, yes, thank you everyone for joining us here this evening. Briefly, I wanted to go over some of the bill language that's influenced the development of the Small Forest Land Grant Program. And so on your screen here, you'll see 762 in section 24 defines a small forest land owner as those owning up to 160 acres west of the crest of the Cascade Mountains, or 640 acres east of the crest of the Cascade Mountains. And so those will be the eligible recipients for field treatment activities. You know, if you own more than 160 acres on the west side, then that would be an ineligible landowner, right? So again, in the bill language, it also asks us to prioritize high-risk areas, address multiple resource concerns. So these are things like insects and diseases, drought mortality, watershed health, proximity to current or past fuel mitigation efforts, and the $5 million in funding does need to be expended by June 30th of 2023. So within this biennium is when these projects will have to be completed. Next slide. Okay, so we'll get into some program components here. You'll see two kind of funding areas. One is a small parcel fuel reduction. Roughly, we're looking at about 25% of the $5 million going to this. That's not set in stone. As Brian Gordon mentioned, we are working with the Committee for Family Forest Lands to inform the content that you see here today. But the small parcel fuel reduction will be an ODF internal competitive process. So ODF districts will work with landowners in their area and then submit either to the area or the Salem office for an internal review. These will be primarily landowner rebates and potentially ODF fuel crews if the local district has that capability on their district. The majority of the funding is going to go to a small forest land grant. And so we're kind of shooting for a 75% of the $5 million going to the small forest land grant. These will be competitively awarded grants to reduce wildfire risk. And at least 75% of the project funds must treat fuel on those private properties defined as small forest landowners. We are going to be requiring a project sponsor to apply, and we'll get into what that means here on when we hit the small forest land grant program. But before we do, I'm going to just tease out some of the small parcel fuel reduction activities. And if we could go to the next slide. Okay. So like we mentioned, rebates and ODF fuel crews. We are going to target vulnerable or underprotected populations. So, you know, there are some areas across the state that may not be protected by ODF protection districts, or may also not have a rural fire district. These are generally pretty remote areas and rural communities. And so we do want to prioritize those. It takes a long time for folks to get out there if there is a fire, high priority. Also, we want to prioritize submissions from ODF districts that involve projects complementing the Oregon Conservation Corps. This was in bill language to the maximum extent possible, including this. The Oregon Conservation Corps was a section in 762 that will have youth corps doing defensible space related activities. And so if to the extent that we can, we want to complement those projects. Second portion of the small parcel fuel reduction will be Firewise communities. These are established Firewise USA communities by the National Fire Protection Association. And, you know, we want these Firewise communities to be applying, but that we also want to allow neighboring properties to be eligible to receive treatment. So perhaps a Firewise community is working with a neighbor that is not a part of their Firewise community, but maybe has a shared road or something like that. We want to expand those footprints if possible. These fire-wise communities will be prioritized based on wildfire risk class. So using the existing 2017 data, and I believe Jeff will show a map here later, but prioritizing high and extreme risk classes for that one. We could go to the next slide. Okay, so switching over to the small forest land grant. Again, this is that 75% of the funding for the small forest land grant program. And like I mentioned, we want to have project sponsors be the ones responsible for developing grant applications, developing, monitoring, submitting invoices. These are all relatively technical hoops to jump through that we prefer project sponsors do rather than landowners having to navigate individually. So you'll see a list here of eligible project sponsors, and we're working with the Committee for Family Forest Land to round this out. And so thoughts on this would be welcome. But you have a list there, and they can charge up to 10% of the project cost to support the development of these grant applications and the administering of them with their landowner partners. If they wish, they can include ODF technical assistance. So some of these sponsors may not have the expertise to assess wildfire risk or treatment planning. And so if an ODF local district has a capacity, up to 15% of those project funds could go to supporting ODF technical assistance, which would ultimately be working with landowners and contractors to ensure that project specifications are met. We can go to next slide. Okay, so here we've got a list of grant eligibility. This is in addition to the definition of a small forest land grant that we covered previously. But we do want these submitted projects to be submitted by project sponsors. These projects need to reduce the risk of high severity wildfires. So high severity wildfire typically is when a fire goes into the canopy and has high tree mortality associated with it. Those fires are harder to contain, harder to fight. So we want to reduce the risk of high severity wildfires, not necessarily all wildfires. At least 75% of the project costs need to support fuel reduction and treatment activities on small forest landowners. And total project sponsor and ODF services cannot exceed 25% of the cost. We're shooting for a project range of 10,000 to 300,000, and this fits nicely with the small parcel grant option that we discussed previously, as well as the large investment program that Jeff is going to get into here shortly. We are recommending 25% match, and I've listed some options for meeting that match. It's not required. Landowner labor rates are eligible, as well as non-state funds from project sponsors, or potentially ODF offices that are working with things like Western States Fire Managers grants. So there's a number of opportunities for match, but it's not a requirement. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is what it looks like. Right here we have a draft scoring rubric, priorities on the left and total points on the right. So clearly describes treatment activities and how future condition reduces risk of high severity wildfire. That's priority number one. We do want project sponsors to be working with multiple landowners. So if the project treats multiple properties, that will score higher than one large landowner, for example. We're really trying to target those intermediate parcel ownerships. 3 and 4, if the project protects critical infrastructure, roadways, or is in a wildfire risk class of high or extreme, we don't want to exclude really strategic projects outside of high or extreme wildfire risk classes, but we do want to prioritize projects within highest risk areas. Number 5 is proposed treatments benefits vulnerable populations or landowners. And 6 gets at that additional resource concerns that was in the bill language. And so we've listed some additional resource concerns here. Utilizes non-commercial forest products is one of those. And an example that comes to mind would be, the production of biochar or something along those lines. 7 is clearly demonstrates adjacency to previous or planned hazardous fuel treatments, recognizing that connectivity, is important when we're drafting and multiple partners on the landscape doing this work. Number 8 is again pulled from bill language, but I did want to make a note that in addition to a forest management plan, if a landowner doesn't have a forest forest management plan, they can still achieve points with being in a priority planning area. These priority planning areas are listed, and we'll be sharing these shortly, and the Committee for Family Forest Lands are influencing this list. But these are relatively large geographic areas. So for example, there's one that covers an entire ecotype in the Willamette Valley with OWEB and their dry and their oak restoration priority area. So if you add up all those and you checked every single box, that would be the maximum score. Again, this is draft. Looking forward to your feedback here. Saw some questions, but for now, I will turn it over to Jeff, who will get into the Forest Restoration and Resiliency Investment Program.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Appreciate your time there. Again, my name is Jeff Burns with the Oregon Department of Forestry. Thank you for being with us tonight. So I'd like to expand the view perhaps a little bit to a landscape scale process that we're embarking on. We've had years of successful projects out there. I'm speaking for ODF, and as we implement Forest Service projects and NRCS projects across the landscape, and oftentimes it has been the kind of the shotgun approach around defensible space and things like that, and has been effective at times. But this is a real opportunity, and maybe the first opportunity for us to utilize general fund with a very focused, laser focused opportunity to look at a landscape scale footprint that works across boundaries with many stakeholders involved. And so we felt very clearly that we wanted to pull together a diverse working group to help us recommend criteria and identify strategic landscapes. We'll be talking a little bit more detail about that landscape scale and what $20 million perhaps could do there on the on the landscape. It's an all lands approach, so it's cross boundary in nature. And as Alex alluded to earlier, the funding must be spent in this biennium. So we have some constraints around that, but feel pretty comfortable we'd be able to do that by June 30th of 2023. And I'll bring up a few more details as we move along. Next slide, please. Okay, so we wanted to pull together a diverse working group to inform and develop criteria for Forest Landscape Restoration and Resilience Program. We recognize the need for representation from all walks of life across Oregon with different values, with different expertise, with a diverse range of perspectives on how to manage this at a landscape scale. And you'll notice, I believe we have a really nice representation here with those folks, and we have some of them joining us this evening, and we'll be able to have an opportunity to chat with them as well as we move on. But you'll notice different ecosystems and different perspectives from east side to west side as well. Next slide, please. We also wanted to take an opportunity to inform that particular work group with technical advisors, and so we have many on our staff, as well as Forest Service staff and NRCS and other agency staff that are advising the work group and intimately involved in each one of our meetings to help direct that expertise to the right person. Oregon's 9 federally recognized tribes really appreciate their perspective and their expertise in the process. Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, we have representation there. OSU Extension has played a major role in informing this process. And specifically for how we set up a monitoring program, the Ecosystem Workforce Program, the Institute for a Sustainable Environment has been intimately involved and appreciate their efforts as well. I would just like to say that we've had 3 meetings so far and plan on having 2 more on the schedule. So far, we've been able to develop very strong relationships, have some very open and transparent conversation on what this means for Oregon and our constituencies out there in the context of, like I'd mentioned, really the first time that we've been able to utilize general fund, which allows us some flexibility outside of some of the parameters of typically utilizing federal dollars or even private donations. And so it really gives us a wide breadth of opportunities to spend funding in some locations and at some time that maybe we haven't been able to in the past. But we have found that developing a request for proposals that will go out soon really has been a good way of putting pen to paper and being able to capture everyone's perspectives as we develop the call for proposals that will go out. We're shooting for the first week in November after we receive public input by November 1st to help inform that process. And then we're looking at that to open the proposals for our partners for over a month, 4 to 5 weeks. And dealing with the holidays as well is a little bit tricky, but the time frame is looking like we can get those submitted sometime in mid to late December, and then be able to begin to score and rank and put projects together in early to mid January. And that's really the time frame that we're looking for at this point. Next slide, please. So some of the criteria that is required in Senate Bill 762 has informed how we approach this process. And so one is to utilize and only accept projects that find themselves in the 4 highest risk classes. And then also some others would include federal lands currently approved under NEPA, treatments that protect human life, property, critical infrastructure, watershed health, and forest rangeland habitat. And another criteria that's lined out in 762 is to be a part of a collaborative partnership that utilizes a landscape scale approach on a large scale. And so you'll notice that I referenced my notes there. There's some certain things that we really want to focus on that is language in the bill, but then there are others that we're developing, looking for some creative space within the work group to take a look at what makes sense out there on the landscape and how do we put funding in areas that maybe haven't traditionally had an opportunity, and how to get really the best bang for our buck in a tight time frame to be spent effectively with a laser focus that really can manipulate fuels and focus on a landscape that matters and makes sense to us a couple of years down the road, and telling the story of success that we can then roll out to our legislature, the governor's office, our constituents, and build a lot of support behind what we're doing, and specifically for the idea of building something that is very long-term in nature. And that's really what we're looking for. Next slide, please. Okay, so one aspect of that, really, like I'd mentioned, is we'd had opportunities in years past to develop projects that might provide defensible space, and that's always a good tool to utilize, but not necessarily a landscape scale tool. And so we really wanted to focus on some successes that we've already seen and utilize effort that has already been on the landscape. And so we're looking at projects of Joint Chiefs projects, RCPP projects, CFLRP projects, a recent 2021 e-board influx of general fund that we were able to utilize very quickly, less than a year ago, that has really developed a lot of great projects on the ground. Western States Fire Managers, which is federal dollars that we've been able to utilize year in and year out successfully, as well as community assistance is another federal fund source. And I really wanted to highlight these because we don't feel that we need to recreate the wheel. We feel that we can utilize success that's already been on the ground and help develop these in a larger landscape, build a bigger footprint, and again, really make change on the landscape, utilizing success that we've seen in the past. Next slide, please. So the investment timeline that we're proposing here is, like I'd mentioned, we've had some meetings already for the work group and very successful meetings in my mind. But the call for projects should be released very soon. Within that document will be the particulars of what we will accept and what will not pass muster with the program. For instance, like I'd said, projects that were NEPA ready projects or found themselves, in those high risk categories. And so as we're developing that, we should get that out the first week of November. We're shooting for November 2nd to get that call for projects out. We'll be having those proposals due in early December, and then we'll have an opportunity to read those, have some conversation with the work group, score them and rank them out, and award projects in early January. The process will begin really with ODF at that point to get DOJ review, to build the scope and the budget, and begin to negotiate to some degree how those projects will look on the landscape with those awardees and begin to build those out. And then we're asking for an interim report sometime in October to be able to collect and review how we're doing. There's also an opportunity for modifications around that time. We'll be able to look at projects and see how they're coming along, and if we need to tinker around the edges and make any changes for success. And then again, all of these projects are due and finalized in June with a final report to the legislature. Next slide, please. Above and beyond that, within section 18, I'd like to just mention that the legislation does call for a 20-year strategic plan in reference to the shared stewardship agreement, which was signed in August of 2019. And that will help prioritize actions and geographies for wildfire risk reduction. We would like to see that as a blueprint for investment to strategically place dollars and expertise, laser focused in particular areas on the ground. It is an all lands and all partners approach. So it will build constituencies that maybe we haven't had in the past, and be really open and transparent and looking for a lot of input from a lot of you all and others that we may not have worked with in the past. We also want to recognize that there are multiple planning efforts that have gone on for years and are in the process right now, and we don't want to lose sight of that. So there's, for instance, the forestry program for Oregon. There's forestry plan, excuse me. There's the forest action plan, which was recently revised with our Forest Service partners, that really helps inform how we do business, as well as the Wildfire Council recommendations that we will also reference. I will say that, and many of you know this, that the Washington DNR has recently developed a 20-year strategic plan for the east side and put a lot of time and effort into that. And so we've really been engaged with those folks in looking at, what pitfalls did they find, what successes did they find as a template to really develop ours. And I think utilizing some of their experience and then turning that into how we do business in Oregon is really going to be, there it is, a blueprint for our success. And we will be getting started on this 20-year strategic plan very soon. We're getting folks in place and building some consensus around how to proceed with the strategic plan. So this will help inform investment across all lands very soon for us and well into the future. So that's all I have right now. I know there's going to be some questions. Derek, back to you, and then I think we'll probably get into some question and answer that will really focus on some of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. I'll start by addressing or at least calling on a few folks to address a couple questions in the chat. But if there are members, if there are any folks who want to comment, please do. And especially if there are any work group members that would like to comment, share any perspective from their experience on the work group, be happy to have you raise your hand and I'll call on you. But any general questions, please raise your hand, but we'll clear those in the chat first. So I don't know if there's any ODF staff who can address this question. If not, I will do my best at it. But are there any elements in Senate Bill 762 for supporting the enhancement of resiliency in urban settings, specifically for homeowners? Alex, you want to field that?
Sure. I did just there's actually a number of other program components in 762 that are going to be much more heavily focused in urban settings. The two that I call your attention to are OSFM's Section 9, which is community risk reduction. Have been coordinating with them, and I know that they're heavily invested in focusing on those areas specifically. In addition, Section 21 is the Oregon Conservation Corps. So that's that youth corps that we were mentioning, and I know that they will be focusing primarily on defensible space, and understand that they'll have an eye towards within urban growth boundaries as well. That said, the only other thing I'd say is WUI. There's multiple different definitions out there, and I think if we're doing defensible space by definition, there'll be a wild and urban interface component. But I think where we really want to focus is kind of more on that, forest meets property rather than city meets forest type space. So hope that answers your question. And if I didn't give you the amounts, Section 21 for Oregon Conservation is 10 million. And I believe OSFM is managing upwards of 25 million for community risk reduction. So significant investments in those areas.
Thank you, Alex. And I would just, those are the programs that I was thinking in Senate Bill 762 as well, that aren't necessarily forestry programs. And again, we're focusing tonight on particular sections for grant programs. But if you do subscribe to the 762 information from ODF, we will try to cross-post as much information from State Fire Marshal's Office, Higher Education Coordinating Commission as the other programs get set up, so that people can get as much information on these as possible. Just want to continue to scroll down through the chat here. And I think this question, Alex, I'll ask for you to field because it was during your presentation about is being part of the county's hazard mitigation plan required to apply for the small forest land grant program?
Great question, Ian. So it's not required, but I've made a note that I would count that as one of those additional planning areas that may receive additional points. And so community wildfire protection plans come to mind. Sometimes they do have planning areas identified, but it is not required to apply.
Thank you, Alex. Next in the chat is a comment and a question from Megan Kreutzberg. And her question comment, and Megan, if you'd like to raise your hand and come on, that is fine. I will just comment and mention that of course, rangeland is specifically called out amongst forest land in Senate Bill 762. The name of the program is not exclusive of rangeland, but I don't know if any other ODF staff would like to comment on the program naming, or just acknowledging that rangeland is certainly included by definition within Senate Bill 762.
I can jump in real quick and just say, I mean, it's great feedback. Jeff, you came off mute. Maybe you have more you want to say there, but I think it's great feedback. And Derek's right that the program is focused both on forest and range ecosystems, and I think it's an omission and an easy inclusion.
Absolutely, and we certainly, whether we may or may not be able to change the name after we've got lots of documents out there already, but we certainly will make a point in the request for proposals to get that word out and make sure that we are connecting with those rangeland folks and those constituents out there. Thank you very much. That is a great point that we missed.
Okay. I'm not sure whether this question would be for Alex or for Jeff, but I think this was also during, I think this came in during Jeff's presentation. Any extra points for projects or landowners with locations within the wildland urban interface boundary as identified in local CWPPs?
Right, I'll take a stab at that first, really, because we haven't developed a point system necessarily for the forest restoration landscape scale projects. We're getting close. We still have to develop that. And so we'll look at that. I think that might be specific maybe to Alex's point metrics there?
Yeah, it may fit into that additional planning area. And Autumn, that's a great comment and kind of goes in line with the previous one about county hazard mitigation plan. So I've made a note to follow up with folks on that one.
Okay. And a question from Edie Dooley. For the landscape section, 18 to 20, will only the lands identified on the map be eligible for grants?
No, and I'd like to back up, and thanks a lot for that question. The language in the bill specifically is identifying strategic landscapes that are ready for treatment. So strategic landscapes that are ready for treatment. And we're trying to focus, and I'm speaking for the work group here, and I'd love to hear from some of those members if you'd like, but we'd like to laser focus and put some funding really in a few spots, 2 to 3, maybe 5 large projects that really affect the landscape in a major way and really move the ball forward like we haven't been able to do in years past. But I think that we all recognize the nuance of what it really looks like out there on the landscape, and that it's really hard here in Salem to look at a map and say in or out. Not sure that that's fair. So I think that within the context of the work group conversation, I would say no, landscapes lands identified on the map would be in or out necessarily, but it's informing the criteria that we're building. And so instead of maybe looking at one particular project or a portion of a project on the landscape, we're beginning to look at a different view of a much larger landscape that will cross multiple boundaries, even political boundaries, and give us something that is really intense on a larger scale. But great point, and we certainly will have that conversation.
Thank you, Jeff. Now, as more questions are coming in, I will just comment that the video of this presentation that we are currently recording, and presentation slides will be made available on ODF's website tomorrow. So it will be available for future access. And just in case you missed something, want to take a look in more detail, now is not the only opportunity. So next question, is the strategic landscape grant program looking for on the ground projects in particular?
We are. The latest conversation is that we're really trying to proportion that out so that fuels will be treated. That's the intent of the program. So we're really looking at on the ground execution of fuels mitigation projects. But we recognize as a work group that there are opportunities to that planning is an important aspect of a project. Monitoring is an important aspect. Following up with other reporting items is an important part of it. So we're really looking at prioritizing projects that are fire mitigation projects, but we will recognize in the call for proposals that there's other aspects of that process as well for a successful project. I think that's what you're getting at there.
Thank you, Jeff. This one looks like it's for Alex. Can the local stewardship forester serve as a sponsor for one of the small forest land grants? I'm concerned that the quote unquote sponsor must be some institution or bureaucracy.
Great question. And maybe I could ask that we pull the slide back up for the small forest land grant program, if that's not too much trouble, because there's two components of that program. And one would be someone like an ODF sponsor. And that's the small parcel forest land. So Megan, I believe it's the second slide into the small forest land grant program. And while we're getting there, I would say for the larger grant program, that's one more up, I believe. Great. So that first one, small parcel fuel reduction, that will be ODF. right? And so ODF stewardship foresters or wildfire planning foresters, would be able to work directly with landowners, in developing a proposal for that. I imagine those are relatively small, kind of 1 to a couple landowners. For the small forest land grant, ODF is eligible to be a participant. And so if a landowner feels more comfortable working with a local ODF forester, I think, that would be ultimately the district's decision, but that forester could facilitate, the inclusion of that project to the project sponsor. So I really do, I'm envisioning this as whoever the landowner feels most comfortable working with, that's where they can start. And if ODF has the capacity, then absolutely they could be the ones working with that landowner on the ground. I hope that answers that question. But I'll make a note. My initial feedback there from some other folks was some initial feedback was it might be hard to have this completely internal ODF, but I'll bring it up as a potential to say, do we want to revisit ODF as an eligible sponsor? Thanks for the feedback.
Thank you, Alex. So I think this one might be for Jeff, but I'll read it in its entirety. Could you please better define your term restoration? Does this refer only to pre-commercial thinning, pile burning? Oops, my chat got lost here. Sorry, I'll pick this up in just a second.
Derek, I've got it here too.
Okay, I just wanted to read for the entire group that pile burning, does this refer only to pre-commercial thinning, pile burning, prescribed fire in high-risk forest and range lands that have not yet burned, or does it include also post-fire recovery within our recently burned landscapes from the catastrophic wildfires over the last few years? Reduction of hazard trees, treating noxious weeds, standing dead trees that are potential fuel risk for future fires.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you, Autumn. I see that. Good question. I will say, I just lost the question as well. Something happened. Well, from memory here, I'll continue to scroll and try to find it. But restoration really does mean those things as far as preparing a forest for a resilient landscape that can accept fire into the ecosystem that makes sense. And we've seen, especially in the fall of 2020 Labor Day fires, the intensity of those fires that burned soils to the point of that they cannot recover, and affected water quality and downstream issues as well. And so when we talk about restoration, we're really looking at providing an ecosystem that is restored to the point of fire resiliency, I think. And so it doesn't include rehabilitation or restoration of lands that are burned. There's other funding sources and opportunities for that particular project. And the intent of this legislation is to provide for the future landscape. And so I hope that I've been able to answer that for you.
Hey, Jeff, I'm looking at the question here in front of me, and I'm wondering a little bit though, there might be a little bit of nuance in here about, looking. I hear what you're saying about the restoration and Autumn. Hopefully I'm dialing in on your question here a little bit. So I'm trying to do. So I hear what you're saying about not, making an investment in restoration specifically with these funds, but what about in those cases where it could be an investment in, fuels concerns on a burn scar looking into the future? I feel like that's maybe the crux of the question here, and that might actually be something for discussion with the work group. I think it's a good question.
Yeah, I'm really glad you reiterated that, Ryan, and certainly, I would like to open that up with the work group and see what the response would be. When I'm thinking of, burned landscape, I'm thinking of bare activities and directional felling and water quality berms and reseeding and things like that. And that's not, the funding is not specific to that, but if it's protecting future resources, then certainly that's a conversation to have. So thank you.
Okay, we're getting more questions by the minute, which is great. Let me just find my place here and we'll continue. All right, the next one is from Columbia Land Trust. Will there be funding for monitoring the work that is funded by these grants?
Yes. That's part of the request for proposal that we were putting together right now. Great point. Thank you.
Okay. Just a comment on a previous response that I think is worth repeating. As part of a large fire district, we are responsible for the risk mitigation in the county plan, but the CWPP is more refined and again, put the responsibility on us. Thanks for addressing the question. And then Margaret Miller from DEQ has a recommendation here. And Margaret, we certainly will capture this from the chat today, but I'd encourage you to add any future comments to email for the ODF staff here as well. I have a recommendation related to the scoring rubric with the small forest land program and possibly for the larger grant program. It is a key objective of the Oregon Smoke Management Plan to, quote, promote the further development of techniques to minimize or reduce emissions by encouraging cost-effective utilization of forest land biomass, alternatives to burning, and emission reduction techniques, end quote. And then there's a OAR rule reference here, 629.04.80010 4F. I strongly encourage that the scoring rubric gives 10 points specifically to these efforts. I know Alex mentioned forest products, biochar as being a topic of interest in the rubric, but it was combined with other efforts like addressing insects and disease. When combined in such a way, it doesn't really have much weight. I know you were looking for feedback on the scoring rubric. So again, for those folks and just Alex and Jeff, Ryan, Megan, and others, I will be saving the chat for you folks to get direct feedback from the chat here. So don't worry about taking notes right now, but I don't know if there's any comment that you'd like to make on the suggestion. But thank you, Margaret, for entering all of that in the chat.
I would add that it's based on committee feedback for the Committee for Family Forest Lands. That was actually a suggested change, but I will flag this as a topic, and if there's a way that we can tease that out. We are covering activities like hauling costs and within priority activities. So I'm hoping that we get some strong grant proposals that include alternatives, but noted, and we'll bring that back to the group for consideration. Thanks, Margaret.
Okay. Thank you, Alex. Let's see, the next is to clarify, would a small municipally owned community forest, 430 acres in total, focused on wildfire risk reduction fit into one of these programs? The forest land encircles the town and is located in a rural high fire risk area, Deep Falls in Jackson County. The town is a new fire-wise community. At first glance, it doesn't appear that the town itself would meet the criteria for either program. If not, is there any flexibility to include small municipally owned land, or are there other Senate Bill 762 funding sources better suited?
Yeah, Alex, I'll jump in there. And thanks, Jenna. I see that question and great point. I think I'd like to just circle back to a point I made, that there's a lot of funding sources out there that we've utilized in years past that are very specific to, either defensible space or ingress, egress, and various lands on the landscape, including our federal forest restoration program, utilizing Good Neighbor Authority, that really allows us to work cross boundary with our federal partners. And this is one area that I don't think we've discussed enough. And that is community lands, county and city property that fits within that gray area of, is it wildland urban interface, or is it, you know, a federal project and private land ownership across that boundary. And so we're looking at utilizing some of this general fund, I believe, specifically to highlight some of these issues that we find in that kind of mid area that you're describing there. And I think that in the larger context of the Forest Restoration and Resiliency Program, this can be one component of that project. And so this project likely will not stand up on its own, but when you can partner with Forest Service and watershed and larger landowners that are all involved in that landscape scale proposal, then this is a component that would fit quite nicely in increasing that footprint across the landscape. So really glad that you brought that up. Alex, you might have a little bit different take with your program, but that's on my mind. So thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. I would just add that based on the definition in 762 section 24, you know, if the municipality owns 430 acres, I believe this area is west of the crest of the Cascades. If I'm correct on that, then they would exceed the 160 acre limit. So they would not be eligible under the Small Forest Land Grant Program. That said, I think there, like Jeff mentioned, there are a number of additional sections out there that may be able to address this, and or, you know, the Small Forest Land Grant may complement, you know, this work from a different funding source. So, yeah, if it's 430 acres on the west side, technically that would not be eligible under the Small Forest Land Grant Program.
Okay, thank you both, Alex and Jeff, for responding to that question. Next, could you reiterate the anticipated range of project size award for the $3.5 million Small Forest Land Owner Grant Program? I think I heard $10,000 to $100,000 or perhaps greater. As sponsors plan grant proposals, I want to get a sense of scale you were looking for. I assume concentrated, impactful work in a subbasin, et cetera, rather than 1,000 points of light across a larger area would be preferred.
Great, thanks, Jim. Yep, so you're right on there. Between for the 3.5 million, it's between 10,000 and 300,000 currently, and the reason for that is that kind of fits nicely within the lower limits of the program that Jeff was mentioning, and then the upper limits of that small parcel fuel reduction program. The second half of your question, spot on. We are looking for concentrated, impactful work, and we're trying to get at that with those grant scoring criteria where you're treating multiple adjacent property owners and kind of achieving that scale of influence. So second, spot on, and currently we're at 10,000 to 300,000 as the range.
Thank you for that, Alex. Okay, now the last comment question we have here: given the recognition of the severe wildfires in Western Oregon in 2020, it is very surprising that none of Northwest Oregon is identified as a fuels reduction area. I am a forester managing a large private timberland in the Western Cascades, and we have been contemplating a linear fuel break, especially since the 2020 fires came so close to the land. It's disappointing that the areas most prone to high severity fire are not being targeted for fuel preparation to slow fire or provide anchors for firefighting for fires blowing over the Cascades during east wind events. So that's commentary. I don't know if someone would has any response there, but it's certainly input that the department could consider when looking at programs. But I don't know if anyone wants to field that.
Sure, I'll jump in there. And thank you, Eddie. I appreciate that point. And one duly noted, we will have that conversation more thoroughly with the work group. I didn't want to put the map up and give anyone a false sense of exactly where and how these projects will happen. That's up for discussion, depending on multiple criteria that needs to be met, not just an area on the map. So thanks for your point. We will discuss that.
What will the process for inviting public comment on grant proposals?
I can try to tackle that one. At this point, this is one of the opportunities for public input into this process in terms of helping to inform the work groups conversations around how to shape up these grant programs and what the application requirements would be, where the investments would go, et cetera. So from that perspective, we're trying to gather all the input here to create those sideboards and set those programs on a good course. I don't think that we're going to be inviting specific public comment on the grant proposals themselves. Those will be reviewed by our work group, and they will help us to rank and score those and make recommendations for funding. I would, though, mention that the meetings of that group are recorded and available on our external website. We always welcome comment through the mailboxes that are linked there on that website. And Jeff, if you have any additional comments there, I certainly welcome you jumping in.
Well, I would only say, and I love it, David, that's a really neat point that you brought up, not one that we think about very often, probably, when we're dealing with, entities out there. And so, organizations, federal partners, soil water conservation districts, landowner associations. It's really hard probably for an individual constituent out there to have time to comment or have an opportunity to comment when we're usually working with really large groups of people. And so I would just encourage you to become, if you're not, and maybe you are, but a part of one of those groups perhaps. And so as we inform our grant process, we are looking for input from fire departments, from county commissioners, from soil water conservation districts, from the NRCS, from the Forest Service, from our other partners, collaborative partners that work directly with the Forest Service. And so there's other opportunities to inform those local groups that then roll up into our larger programs and really try and really benefit the state as a whole. So really neat comment. I hope that I touched on that. But I think that at the local level, there's probably an opportunity to inform how we do our work. So thanks, David.
Okay. So again, just for reminder, what are the acre limits again for the small woodland grants? What about age class requirements for fuels?
Great question. So the acreage limits have to do with parcel ownership. So 160 acres west of the crest of the Cascade Mountains, or up to 640 acres. That's for an individual property owner. That doesn't mean to say there couldn't be multiple properties that would combine to be more than 160 acres of treatment. But in terms of an individual owner, those are the limits. So 160 west, 640 on the east side. For age class requirements for fuels, currently those aren't in the grant requirements. But generally, when we think about reducing the risk of high severity wildfire, I think that's where the technical experts in treatment planning will come in, right? And so there's an upper limit to where if you remove, for example, a large tree, pruning would be the way to reduce high severity wildfire on a large tree rather than removing. But currently we don't have an age class requirement on that. Thanks.
Thanks, Alex. Another follow-up in regards to that program. What is the anticipated timeline for the first round of proposals to the $3.5 million small forest land grant program?
Great question, Jim. So I think, we're looking at a similar timeline that Jeff had mentioned for, the final call for proposals being released here in the next month. perhaps early December, and then open. Yeah, we want to give folks enough time, recognizing it's the holidays. So I would imagine that it'll be open for a decent portion of January. The main thing driving that timeline is just getting this feedback, incorporating it, and then really wanting to give folks an opportunity to do some on-the-ground treatment, this spring before fire season hits. So we're trying to get it pushed out as fast as we can, but look for a final call for proposals here within the next month or so.
So I'm going to get to another comment here, but I have gotten a couple direct message questions that I just want to tee up, Alex, for you to prepare to, and then Megan. If you would please share the slide on the Small Forest Land Grant Program and sponsors. Again, there was a question about whether that was an exhaustive list of sponsors or whether it was examples. Alex, I'll let you address specifically, but if we can go back to the sponsor slide and have you cover that again, Alex. And then after that, Megan, if you could share the ENVC risk class map again, so folks can view that during the presentation. And again, for everyone, the video and the slides will be available on ODF's website tomorrow, so you'll have unfettered access to see them, whether we have them presented on the slide or not. Okay, thank you, Alex.
Yep. So the question, is this an exhaustive list? We're intending that it would be an exhaustive list, but if we're missing folks on this, I'd love to hear your feedback on that. You'll see a 501c3 is on here, and so that encapsulates a number of organizations that aren't on this list. Other state or local government natural resources agencies, there's a number that fall within that category. County foresters come to mind. So I think the intent would be that this is an exhaustive list, but if there's organizations that are missing that should be on here, I'd like to hear about those.
A comment from Chandra of the work group that folks could also reach out to work group members regarding comments on grant proposals and on criteria. There is on ODF's website for that forest restoration and resiliency investment program. There is work group information, which includes member lists. So you can access that and reach out to any of the work group members as well. Thank you, Chandra. And then someone asked to flash the map slide up again, that the numbers appeared really small. Again, it's up here on the presentation for you to see, but it will be available tomorrow as well for everyone to access on the ODF site. So another follow-up comment here. I am a bit surprised by the statutory limit on small forest landowner size for the west side. 160 acres. That tells me the target is fairly populated rural residential landscapes, which does perhaps make sense regarding non-forest resources at risk. If we had a parcel mixed in greater than 160 acres and used non-grant funds to do that work, would that count as a match in the application? By non-forest, I mean life and property. So I don't know, again, the chat will be made available to ODF staff for comments. I don't know if anyone wants to address that.
Jeff, you might have to help me out here. To me, that sounds more like leverage than match. Demonstrating that there's cross-boundary, adjacency of other grant funds, but I'd have to look into that more.
So Alex, if it helps at all, I think where Jim's going with that is, if you have a 200-acre parcel, so it exceeds the 160-acre limit. If they used other funds to treat the 40 acres, say the 40 acres between the 160 and 200, could that be considered the match for the project for the treatment on the 160?
Right, same land ownership, right?
Yeah.
Well, if I heard you right there, Ryan, then I think that landowner would be over 160 acres. In which case, I think that would make it ineligible, but I may have heard it wrong again, so apologies if I did.
That might be one for us to dig into a little bit.
Yeah.
And Jim, we know where to find you.
That's right.
All right. So next, Alex, can you circle back with a few more specifics on funding for Firewise communities? Funding amounts, criteria for funding, do they need a sponsor? Do those funds need to correspond to the 4 highest risk classes? Is that just a subset of the 3.5 million, or is that something separate? I think I missed several details there, or maybe conflating them with the other funding opportunities.
So the Firewise communities do not need a project sponsor, though it will be an internal ODF process. So we have a Firewise National Fire Plan Coordinator who works closely with Firewise communities. And she will be collecting applications based on some grant criteria, some project eligibility criteria that we're currently drafting right now. Funding amounts, I think right now we have it limited at 50,000. That could be, I think right now we're at 50,000. And the place that we want to focus on with this is really outside of urban growth boundaries. In conversations with OSFM and the Oregon Conservation Corps and the HEC, I think they're going to be focusing heavily on like interior urban growth boundaries. So what we're really wanting to focus on with these communities are outside of urban growth boundaries, recognizing that I think OSFM has plans to work with them within urban growth boundaries. The 4 highest risk classes, right now we have that as a ranking system. So if you're in the highest risk class 1, that would be 4 points. If you're in the class 2, that would be 3 points. Class 3 would be 2, class 4 would be 1 point. That's in addition to other point systems. And so we'll get this posted online on the Small Forest Land Grant Program page here. I think we should have it here in a week or two. It's not a subset of the 3.5. So the 3.5 is a small forest land, that's the Small Forest Land Grant. The remaining 1.5 of the $5 million program would be available to Firewise communities and small parcel defensible space and rebates. So separate from the 3.5, relatively small portion, I think, less than $1 million for sure going to Firewise communities. But if I can reach out to you direct and encourage folks to check in with that landing page for the Small Forest Land Grant, which we'll have that information up in the coming weeks.
Thank you, Alex. I'm going to jump ahead in a couple of the comments just because Jim commented back for you, Ryan. I didn't mean that, Ryan. I agree, more leverage than match. But what is the difference between recommended match and leverage?
You want to offer your thoughts there, Alex?
Shucks, I don't. I'll have to dig into it a little bit more. In my mind, leverage is a little more flexible than match. Generally match is kind of direct cost associated with a project that's coming in from another source. Rhetorical question. Great. Well, thanks for saying it. Appreciate it.
That's funny.
All right, thanks, Jim. I get a little literal in the chat comments. Wanted to make sure that everyone's comments are heard, if not fully addressed. So appreciate that additional comment. We can just circle back to other people's comments. Thanks, Jim. Okay. If I recall correctly, some marketable timber was mentioned as a way of assisting project funding. Is there a danger that encouraging marketable timber harvest will turn this program into an encouragement for commercial logging operations?
Sure. No, I'm not on mute. Okay. Yeah, and great point, Alan. Thanks for bringing that up. I'm not sure that marketable timber had been mentioned. I would say that it is any one of these projects on a landscape scale that would be subsidized with general fund to provide fire mitigation may or may not, have some marketable product as a result. And that, may or may not be part of the project. I think that when you're talking about landscape scale across boundaries, There will be some opportunities for marketable timber and others that will be fully subsidized mitigation projects. And so the program is not encouraging marketable timber harvest. That's not really part of it. If that's a subset, say, of the project on some landscape, then that's really neither part of our program or not part of our program. I think that when we develop the criteria and the request for proposals, there will be opportunities within that to have all sorts of different projects, and some may have some marketable timber, but that's not encouraged in the program. It's not necessary. It's not considered match or leverage. It just is a subset of the larger project, and we will not have any kind of opinion likely on whether that happens or not.
Thank you, Jeff. And this question, I'll ask that Jeff and or any work group members feel free to jump in and respond, since the question asks, do you or your work group envision developing any criteria or guidelines that may disqualify a proposal or certain aspects of a proposal, such as cutting older, larger, ecologically valuable trees over a certain age or size?
Well, yeah, and to that point, another great point, David, is that within the language of the bill, there is certain language, and I can certainly tease that out, of exactly some disqualifying projects, and that would be, in riparian areas and certain things that are written specifically in this language. But beyond that, any one of the projects out there will need to follow all the rules and regulations and intent of the Forest Practices Act and NEPA ready projects on federal land. So there's absolutely no change or influence that this program will have on any existing rules and regulations that we already have to live with. And so this is just very simply a fuels mitigation project. And so where it makes sense, we'll utilize it, and where it can't be done, we won't do it.
I might also just add, Jeff, as you've said many times here, that these projects are landscape scale in nature and involve a lot of partners, and typically are the result of collaborative efforts, partnership efforts that are quite mature and involve a lot of different local organizations. And just thinking about both of these questions, there are a lot of different tools in the toolbox, and the projects have really been designed, I think, with a lot of good local input and a lot of good consensus among a diverse group of local stakeholders. And I just think it's important in the context of these questions and the response that you were given, Jeff. I just think it's important to consider that as well, if that helps add any more context.
Ryan, Jeff, thank you both. This question from Autumn: given the short application window, is the anticipation that the 20-year strategic plan be completed at the time of application submission?
Yeah, really good point. And a little bit of the cart before the horse here. We recognize that the 20-year plan is a long process that will be well developed over the next couple of years and into the future as well. Given the existing planning documents and efforts that are in place, we have a pretty good understanding. Well, we have better than that. We have a really good understanding of where projects need to be done on the landscape. And to Ryan's point, vetted and through real thoughtful process with lots of different perspectives to be able to implement that. The 20-year plan is really going to be looking at the future of where we put our funds and our expertise and our laser focus on the landscape. And no telling what may happen in 10 years. I could imagine that a 20-year plan is an ongoing document that will be living and changing with time and making sure that we're informing the process to get it right, at that particular time. So good point. It's a long-term strategy.
And we'll be developing that 20-year plan over the next, 18 months or so.
Oh, I thought you were about to say 18 years, which is about right. We'll be making changes and updates and making sure that it makes sense.
Okay. So there are several exchange of comments here about recommended match and leverage. I'm going to summarize several of these just for Alex, Jeff, that it seems that whatever clarity can be provided in the application and criteria around match, recommended match, be as clear as possible so people understand. And if there is a specific question that any of the commenters would like addressed, please enter that. But I just we'll skip over some of the back and forth commentary, but I do appreciate the input that having clear scoring rubric as to what counts towards the recommended match and what doesn't would be nice to know. So clarity there would be helpful. Another question, are there going to be cultural resource surveys or inventories required for these projects?
Absolutely. Where they are required now, they will continue to be required. And that is, for instance, through our, if a project has a portion of it on federal land, it must be NEPA ready, and that process exists, and that will be respected.
And assuming then as well, if it's on tribal land or any portions on tribal land, then a cultural survey will have to be done and so on.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Given the timeline, is there a resource to reach out to for further guidance in order to be prepared for the opportunity for our area?
Well, so right now I'm looking at Jeff and Alex, but they're going to be our at the moment our primary staff points of contact as we roll this out, and we are actively working to hire additional capacity to help with implementation of these programs. But Jeff and Alex are our leads for these two programs, so I think they would be your good points of contact.
And I'll just throw out for both of them that the email addresses, the email links on the ODF website for both of these programs is probably a great first way to get into the door for your technical questions.
Sure. And as we've developed this further too, and kind of build this out over the next couple of weeks, we're really going to take every opportunity that we can to get those requirements and the particulars of each one of these programs out to our districts, our ODF districts, and our partners that we're working very closely with. And so stand by. Lots more information to come out that will be finalized in the next couple of weeks.
Thank you. So I will at least ask for someone to address the question, because I think maybe multiple terms have been used. Recommended match, required match, which one? What does that look like in the criteria for each of the grant programs?
Yeah, maybe I could take a stab at this, Alex, if you don't mind. We've been processing a lot of federal grants for years and years. And so the Code of Federal Regulations lines it out in a particular way. And so a match requirement is a one-to-one match. And so every dollar that's spent on the ground or granted through our federal partner is required for a $1 to be spent on the project that are non-federal dollars. Now, that can be in kind as well. So it doesn't have to be $1, but it has to represent that unit. And that might be someone's time. It could be equipment time. It could be donations, whatever the case may be. So if there is a required match of 50-50, then that is what I just explained. If there's a recommended match, then that may be scored through a rubric. It might be an opportunity for projects to show that there is some skin in the game, so to speak, by local resources. but that's only recommended. And so that's a little bit of wiggle room on whether that's going to receive a higher score or provide a priority project over another. Leverage, in my humble opinion, is really describing the larger landscape where projects, and it's not just for dollars, it's expertise, it's effort that is put into a project on the landscape, could be leveraged to improve or provide some adjacency to the proposed project. And that would expand the footprint in a way that is leveraged. Does that make any sense? I hope I got that right.
I think Jim sparked a good conversation here. It's a good rhetorical question, Jim.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to address this one right off. EJ Davis asks if ODF staff please compile and share the questions they received with the work group. And I had just commented back saying the questions and comments from the chat will be summarized and provided to work group members ahead of meetings. EJ, I will also just, I'll put it in chat, but mention that all of the comments and public input that comes from this meeting through email, all of the public input that's received will be summarized and provided to work group members through the work group process. So there was a question that I want to make sure and get to here. Are there other grant programs you can direct those of us this grant program won't help to? I'm a small woodland owner in Columbia County on 50 acres forest land. Thanks. So I don't know if there are any other grant programs that you guys are familiar with that you might be able to mention.
Gosh, I'd love to address this. I'm scrolling and not seeing the exact question. Oh, I got it. Okay. There are multiple grant programs that ODF facilitates. There are others in other organizations that can help you, specifically thinking of NRCS as another opportunity for you. But depending on what your ultimate goal and objective is with your property, if it's strictly a fire mitigation program, then a Western States Fire Managers grant could potentially be an opportunity for you. If it's for insect and disease, then there are certain bark beetle grants that are made available through the Forest Service that we manage. So it kind of depends on what your ultimate goal may be. And the best place to start would be with your local ODF district or unit office that can have that conversation, because what we, as I described earlier in the conversation, we are getting away a little bit to some degree from kind of the one-offs out there that provide for small landowners and looking at a larger landscape scale. Not to say that we're not doing that, but the opportunity that we're looking for is to roll up projects to a larger footprint. And so if you start with your local farm services agency or your local ODF district or unit office there in Columbia City or Columbia County, excuse me, then you'll have an opportunity to perhaps get on board with one of the rolled up larger programs that we're working towards. Hopefully that helps you.
And within the chat, Columbia Land Trust comments that other grant opportunities check with SWCD and NRCS. I'm not familiar with those acronyms, but I'm sure the Columbia County folks are.
I might just add that, so we've got a Find a Forester tool on our website that folks can use to locate their local ODF stewardship forester. And so that's a good tool, depending on, you can get in there and locate your property, click on the map, and it'll give you a direct contact. But there are also other resources available, as the chat highlighted there. OSU Extension is another good place to go. And I might also suggest that you check out knowyourforest.org.
Thank you, Ryan, for a bunch of great resources there to check out. Thank you. Comment from Autumn, super informative, great presentations and responses to questions. Thanks so much for this opportunity and your time and effort. Very helpful. And then just another comment on leverage and match is that Water Enhancement Board's definition is that match is required and leverage is above the required match. So that's from theirs. Thanks for sharing. Let's see. And EJ Davis shared a link for Oregon State's Forestry Natural Resources for additional resources. And thank you for at least explaining for me the acronyms Soil and Water Conservation District and Natural Resources Conservation Service. Thanks so much. For those of you that I'm sure don't know, I'm newer to forestry, so the acronyms kind of fly by my head a little bit. So thanks for that. And then just another comment, I will ask my forester. He's been a terrific resource. Thank you. So I do want to at least allow for last round of questions in the chat. I'd also ask for any input or commentary from work group members or any last input or clarifying points from any of our presenters.
Oh, very quickly, I'll just mention Derek, one of the work group members sent me a quick note to remind everyone that this funding that we're talking about these projects are to be completed June of 23. It's biennium funding.
That is a great reminder, an important distinction as people start to plan for projects and for bidding on the grants. So I don't see anything more coming into the chat. We've got about 20 minutes left in our scheduled time today. I then will just, if I'm not seeing any hand raises or comments from work group members, we'll just give this just another 15, 20 seconds. And if no one else has additional questions, I'll invite any of the work group members or ODF staff to make any closing comments.
I'm happy to jump in with some closing comments when we get there, Derek. Just give me the word.
I think I'm just seeing a bunch of thank yous and you're welcome from folks. Oh, here's a last question. Here's the limit to the number of applications a sponsor can submit.
The more the better, Autumn. No, there is no limit. So.
Okay, so yes, please, Ryan. We'd love some love some closing comments from you before we close out for the night.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for making time again this evening, especially the members of the work group and the staff who put in the effort to put the presentations together and be here this evening to answer the questions and engage in the conversation. I really do want to. I know we keep mentioning it over and over, but reiterate the resources available on ODF's website, including recordings of the work group meetings that are available for folks to review. And in particular, drive folks towards those two mailboxes, one for the landscape scale, the $20 million program, one for the small forest landowner, the $5 million program. Do want to be thoughtful of staff time here and encourage folks to submit their comments and questions through those mailboxes. Just remind you all that we will be taking all the comments that we receive by 5 p.m. next Monday, November 1st. So if there were things that we didn't get to here, there's some more detailed information that you want to share, or other things come to mind after the fact that you want to get to us, please do get them in by that deadline, and we'll get all that information summarized and provide it to the work groups. And we will continue to do that too on a rolling basis as we receive comments or questions that come through. As Emily Jane had asked there, we'll be sure to get that stuff summarized and provide it to those groups for their consideration. Those were all the notes that I had scribbled down. A lot of great questions and some good comments for additional consideration. And I'm really looking forward to the next work group meeting. So thank you all.
Thank you for those closing comments, Ryan. I will then just mention to everyone that we will conclude for the night, that the recording and presentation materials will be made available on the Department of Forestry website. And sorry, one last question here. Do you anticipate utilizing all of the funding? And if not, what happens to the leftover funds? I think I can answer for all of ODF when I say that all of the funds will be used. Jeff, Alex, Ryan, I don't know if there's any other comment around that, but everything I've heard from everyone on multiple program side is that this is available funding for this biennium, and everyone is doing everything they can to make sure that we can get on the landscape and make changes as much as possible through these grants. Jeff, Alex, Ryan, any further comment on that?
No, well put, Derek.
Okay. And no need to apologize, Autumn. It's a good question, but there is a priority here at Forestry to make sure that all of the grant funds are used to make sure to affect landscapes. So again, any further questions, comments, please send them to the email boxes that are available on oregon.gov/ODF. Follow the links for Senate Bill 762. Subscribe for information to Senate Bill 762. You'll receive regular updates, and there will be future opportunities for public input on these and other processes. So thank you for sharing time with us tonight. We appreciate you joining us. We had a large participant pool, and it just speaks well to the interest in these programs. We thank you for the chance to clarify everything. So thank you and have a good evening.